At the end of Imani Perry's extraordinary book, Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, she describes her love of Easter. This comes on the heels of a beautiful account of the challenges her boys will face in a world such as ours, as well as her gentle and loving effort to hand over to them the beauty and power of our inheritances. We are more than objects of racism, she tells them. Our lives are more than the wreckage and ruins left over after the plunder. She insists they tend to their interior lives, sit with their fears, and imagine themselves in the most expansive of terms. Grace makes room for this. Follow your yearnings, she instructs. Take time to strip yourselves down to the core, to the simplest of joys. It is a ritual of reorientation, she says, a steadying, a sense of grace, end quote. And do so, she seems to suggest, in the full light of a tradition, in the full light of an inheritance that is the wind beneath your wings. She begins the book with a response in part to the all too familiar American refrain that, quote, it must be terrifying to raise a black boy in America. And with the first sentence, an echo really of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, and a refutation, to be sure, of the celebration of Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me. She announces her response to such fears, quote, between me and these others who utter the sentence, the indelicate assertion hangs midair. Without hesitation, they speculate as if it is a statement of fact. I look into their wide eyes. I see them hungry for my suffering, or crude with sympathy, or grateful they are not in such circumstance. Sometimes they're even curious. It makes my blood boil, my mind furnace hot. I seldom answer a word, end quote. Hers is a different scene of instruction. We are not reducible to our circumstance, she tells her children. We, you, are more than the hatred that threatens to consume. But it is the end of the book that draws my attention this morning. Again, she declares Easter as a favorite holiday, not Christmas. She recalls singing, "He arose with the mighty triumph over foes. He arose a victor from the dark domain, and he lives forever with his saints to reign." This is the culmination of all that she wants to give to her boys, a kind of resilience and grit, an inheritance that equips them to face the storms because the storms are always coming. She says to her babies, who are no longer excited about Easter because they're big, you know? They're no longer excited about the Easter baskets and dressing in seersucker and linen. She says to them that, quote, I will keep taking you to Mass because I know you will need it, even if not precisely in this way. In the wake of all this death, the eternal spring. Something in the wake of all this death, the eternal spring. It reminds me of that moment in Baldwin's essay, Nothing Personal, quote, I have been, as the song says, buked and scorned. I know that I always will be, but my God, in that darkness, which was the lot of my ancestors, in my own state, what a mighty fire burned. In that darkness of rape and degradation, that fine flying froth in midst of blood, through all that terror and all that helplessness, a living soul moved and refused to die, end quote. That confrontation with madness that we talked about yesterday evening demands something of us, something more. Something rooted in a heritage that belongs to all of us, that eternal spring. And this isn't a guarantee. I'm not talking about a guarantee that all will be well, that in the end, darkness will give to light. Spring always comes, but so does winter. Here, Perry guides the eyes of her sons to what's possible, to the as yet And that becomes the basis for a different kind of imagining, what she calls a revolutionary possibility. We are more than our circumstances. We are more than what the world says about us. Just look at how we got over. Now this term, this semester, I taught my seminar on James Baldwin's nonfiction again. The last time I taught it, Donald Trump was running for office. This time I'm teaching it in the moment when the fever dreams have spiked. And as usual, as typical in the seminar, we began with notes of a native son, read closely, nobody knows my name, and the fire next time, set with no name in the street, and ended with the evidence of things not seen. And in between, we read fugitive essays and speeches and interviews, even the last interview just a month before his death. In all the years of my reading and teaching Baldwin, this time, in this moment, I noticed something different. And here is an extension of last night's lecture. I noticed something different, that a kind of madness shadows the page. Baldwin struggles to hold himself together. And I'm not simply referring to the several suicide attempts that defined his life, right? And I'm not simply referring to those attempts, that much is evident. I'm talking about his manic attempts to keep himself together in the face of a maddening world. The madness that I attributed to the country last evening touches each of us, especially those who have to bear the brunt of it all. I suppose all this came into view because, to be honest with you, behind my smile, but just a moment to pause and look into my eyes, you will probably see that I'm not quite right. Grief and death saturate this place. And because of the demand of capital, we haven't had time to tend to the broken pieces. COVID. People we loved didn't die right. And where I'm from, on the coast of Mississippi, where magnolia trees bloom, cypress trees cast shadows on bayous. Where I'm from, when people don't die right, they don't stay in the ground. They haunt. COVID. And of course, there's the anger and the hatred. The country seems haunted. The ghosts have us by the throat, using our own hands to take our breath away. And because of my presence on television, I have to bear witness to it all every single day. Just this morning, 5 people are dead in Texas. Another mass shooting. And sometimes I want to scream at the top of my lungs. And the maddening part, of course, is the repetition. Having to bear witness to the same thing over and over and over again. Wash, rinse, and repeat. I know intimately what Baldwin meant in his last interview when he said, quote, "You are a broken motor. You're repeating, and it causes a breakdown," he says, lessening of the will of power, lessening of willpower, and sooner or later, your will gives out. It has to, he says. And you're lucky if it is a physical matter, because it could have been mental. I know what he meant. At least now I do. We're not quite right. Now, when my students this year read the essay Notes of a Native Son, I was prepared to talk about Jimmy's vexed relationship to his father. Ready to profess my own vexed relationship with my own dad. Ready to talk about how Baldwin aligns his father's death, the 1943 Harlem riots, and the birth of his sister in this marvelous parable about the perils of the nation and the difficulties of self-creation. And if my dad is watching this, I love you to death, Pops. But what hit me squarely in the face, this time, and unlike the August summer heat of Charleston, I'm going to reference the August summer heat of Mississippi. Suffocating heat. Right? That humidity will wear you out. And what hit me squarely in the face, like the humidity of a Mississippi summer, was the prevalence of madness in the piece. In fact, I've come to read this essay, Notes of a Native Son, as a meditation on madness. Of course, there's the madness of the nation that refuses to know itself and creates a world in such a way to avoid confrontation with that refusal. And the consequences for those who bear the brunt of that refusal are brutal. Baldwin's stepfather illustrates that. And we're forced to live with the idea that because of the color of our skin and because of the color of yours, that somehow that says something about our value and about our worth. And we have to move mountains to keep that insidious idea from taking hold in our guts. Eventually, Baldwin's stepfather would be, quote, locked up in his terrors, as Jimmy put it, where the disease, quote, of his mind allowed the disease of his body to destroy him, end quote. Baldwin's stepfather believed what the world said about him, and as a result, he lived, quote, and died in an intolerable bitterness of spirit. And Baldwin confesses really, that bitterness had in fact become his own. That the bitterness had become his own. He tells the story of a moment in New Jersey on Route 1, right down the street from Princeton University, where with a friend he entered a diner for the fourth or fifth time perhaps, waiting to be served, only to be ignored and then told by the waitress that, quote, we don't serve Negroes, end quote. Blinded with rage, Baldwin hurls a glass at the waitress's head, only to shatter the mirror behind the bar. And this scene is prefaced by a description of his state of mind. Quote, I first contracted some dread chronic disease, the unfailing symptoms of which is a kind of blind fever, a pounding in the skull and fire in the bowels, end quote. The madness of his father against the backdrop of a mad world is now his own, and this Bildungsroman, this coming-of-age story that is a Notes of a Native Son, reveals the depth of that madness and what is needed to break the fever, to break free. He had to run for his life. He had to run away from America. He had to leave this place in order to vomit all that was deposited in his gut up. One has to let go of the hatred that fuels the rage, Baldwin writes. And here the hatred is directed towards the nation and towards the stepfather. But he says of his father, quote, I had hated him and I wanted to hold on to this hatred. I did not want to look on him as a ruin. It was not a ruin I had hated. I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hatreds so stubbornly is because they sense once hatred is gone, they then will be forced to deal with pain. Once the hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain.